Brooklyn Nets guard James Harden left their most recent matchup against the New York Knicks with a hamstring strain, and this was a very concerning one for everybody because he had missed the prior two games. The prior two games before their Knicks matchup, Harden was dealing also with a hamstring strain, and after he had re-injured it during that game, he had been doing the rehab process. It looked like everything was going well. Unfortunately, today's sources have revealed that Harden has in fact suffered a setback in the rehab process, and he's currently out indefinitely. Now, on the actual play that Harden got re-injured on against the Knicks, it didn't necessarily look like he had a typical mechanism of injury, but when a person is dealing with a hamstring strain, because they have a prior history of one, this puts them at greater risk for re-injury. Since some people may not be too familiar with the anatomy associated with a hamstring strain and why something can cause a person to re-injure that hamstring, and finally why these injuries just seem to linger among athletes, I'm gonna go ahead and focus on that in today's video. Welcome, basketball fans. For those of you that aren't familiar with me, my name is Nick Gallo and I'm a doctor of physical therapy. With this video, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at James Harden's most recent re-injury of his hamstring against the Knicks, and then I'm also going to go over the most recent piece of news that we found out today. First, I'm going to start off by showing the video of the play that Harden re-injured his hamstring on against the Knicks. Then I'll go over the anatomy associated with a hamstring strain. And finally, I'll go over some potential causes of hamstring strains and what can also lead to re-injury. If you like today's video and you find it informative, please hit that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel because I will be making more videos in the future regarding sports injuries, rehabilitation, and other physical therapy related content. Also, if you have any comments or questions, please leave those in the section below. Now to begin, let's go ahead and we'll take a look at the play that Harden re-injured his hamstring on.
Here we see as Harden dribbles in, he's going to dish it out, and right after the play, he's going to walk off and tell Steve Nash to take him out of the game. Here's another clip of the play in slow motion.
Now here I have my model of the thigh and lower leg, and of course we have our femur bone right here, followed by the tibia down here, and finally the fibula. Now when we're talking about the hamstrings, those are actually located on the back or the posterior portion of the thigh. Now the hamstrings is actually a group of three separate muscles, and they are the semimembranosus, which is located medially or along the inside portion of the thigh. Then we have the semitendinosus, which is also located medially. However, this muscle actually sits right on top of the semimembranosus. And finally, we have a muscle known as the biceps femoris. This is located more laterally or towards the outside portion of the thigh. Now here I have a model of the hip, and this is applicable because it's really important to say that all three of these muscles actually originate into an area on the hip known as the ischial tuberosity. This is commonly referred to as the sit bones, and so they're actually going to originate right in through here on the hip. Now, as those muscles originate on that ischial tuberosity, they're going to come down in their respective locations, and actually all three of these muscles actually cross the knee joint. So for example, we have our biceps femoris that actually has a short and a long head. They're going to cross the knee joint and attach onto the fibula. Then as we have the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus, they're also going to cross the knee joint and attach onto the tibia. Now, this is very important where these muscles are located because predominantly we associate the hamstring with something known as knee flexion, or when we are bending the knee, that is when the hamstring muscle is going to contract. Because it also attaches on the hip as well, it's also going to play a major role in hip extension. Another major role that the hamstrings have is that they are actually something known as an antagonist to a group of muscles known as the quadriceps, or the quad for short. The quadriceps, of course, are located on the front portion or the anterior portion of the thigh. And this is a very important relationship because the quadricep muscles are actually going to work to extend the knee. And while this is happening, the hamstrings are actually required to stretch. So if you can take a look on this model here, as the quadricep muscles are contracting, they are shortening. And you can see right here that as they're shortening on top, the hamstring muscles actually have to lengthen on bottom. And of course, when the knee goes into knee flexion, the hamstring muscles are shortening and the quadricep muscles have to stretch as well. Now, of course, normal knee flexion and extension does not happen that slow. If you think of if a person is running or walking, for example, this is going to be happening simultaneously throughout that motion for however long they do it. Now, if you think of a professional athlete, they are running constantly, they're jogging, they're being athletic throughout the day. So you can imagine both of these muscles need to be working perfectly with each other to prevent injury. As of right now, we don't know what specific muscle that James Harden is dealing with in terms of his hamstring strain, but in terms of the research and in terms of clinical experience, most often we see that it is actually the biceps femoris. And this is because that biceps femoris actually plays a major role in deceleration when a person is going to be running. So if you can imagine, as a person is extending that knee, it's going to work to decelerate it so that a person does not overextend. And that's kind of what we saw in his most recent re-injury against the Knicks. It seemed that as he was dribbling and as he was driving, he was going, and then as he went to decelerate and sort of stop himself, that's when he started to get that discomfort and tightness in the hamstring area, and that's why he ultimately did not return to the game. But once again, we don't know exactly what muscle that Harden is dealing with the strain in, so it could be any one of those three hamstring muscles. Now, there are some risk factors that can essentially make a person have a greater risk of these hamstring strains. One, of course, is a prior hamstring injury most recently, and we know that before that Knicks game, he was in fact dealing with one. Another big thing that can predispose a person for a hamstring injury like this is if the quadricep muscles are actually so strong that they overpower the hamstrings, because once again, they do act as antagonists for each other. So if the quadricep is way too strong, then as the hamstring has to work to essentially decelerate the leg as it goes forward, this over time can cause little micro injuries in that hamstring muscle, thus leading to an eventual strain. Another very big thing that is going to essentially put a person at a big risk for these hamstring strains is if their glute muscles are actually not strong enough to be the primary hip extender on the body. Now, the gluteus maximus is going to be that muscle that is the main muscle involved in extending the hip. But like I said before, the hamstring can also play a role in hip extension as well. But if the glutes are not strong enough to be that primary hip extender, as a person is running over time, this can also lead to the hamstring muscles getting overworked, thus resulting in a hamstring strain. And of course, one other thing that can also predispose somebody for a hamstring strain such as this is if they don't have the proper flexibility, because once again, it is working as an antagonist to that quadricep muscle. So as that knee is extending, the hamstring needs to be able to stretch properly. But if a person has a very shortened hamstring or is just not very flexible, then this can also lead to an eventual hamstring strain. But once again, I don't know the actual cause for this hamstring strain. I do know that these are the most common ones that I've seen in personal practice, and with some that we will see oftentimes in the research. Now, there is, of course, a grading system for hamstring strains like most injuries, and they are grades 1, 2, and 3. In a grade 1 hamstring strain, this is considered very mild, and typically a person is going to heal in a number of days to about a week. In a grade 2, this is when a person is going to have a partial muscle tear of the hamstring muscle. And finally, in a grade 3, this is where we're going to see a full tear of either the muscle or the attachment. Now, if you watch any of my other videos, you know that I've often referenced the term right. Now, if you watch any of my other videos, you've noticed that I've referenced the acronym RICE, which stands for Rest, Ice, Compression, Elevation. You're going to do all of those things for a hamstring injury, but we're going to actually add a couple other letters to this, making the acronym PRICER. So P is actually going to stand for you want to protect the area. R, of course, is for rest. I is for ice. C is for compression. E is for elevation. And R is for rehabilitation. In this case, you really want to rehab the hamstring musculature properly so that it recovers and that you can resume normal activity. So of course, right after an injury happens, we're going to be doing all those things. Then when they are in the rehab phase, we are going to work in some gentle range of motion exercises because we don't want to contribute to any more damage of the strained hamstring. Then as a person, of course, is feeling better and they're out of that inflammatory phase, which takes about 7 days or so, then we can start to work in other types of things depending on how the person is feeling. By the end of the treatment for a person recovering from a hamstring strain, we want to make sure that that hamstring muscle is very flexible. We want to make sure that it is, of course, very strong as well, and that there's not a major muscle imbalance between the strength of the quadriceps and the strength of those hamstring muscles. And finally, we're going to do a lot of glute strengthening to make sure that that's giving that person that adequate hip extension. One thing that's really important to say when a person is dealing with a hamstring strain is that oftentimes they will have an MRI, and sometimes an MRI can be completely clear where it shows that a person seems to have healed completely from the hamstring strain, but that's not always the case. And sometimes this can happen where a person gets a clear MRI and they're rushed back, or they start to push it a little more because they feel good and they know the MRI turned out clear. I'm not saying that's what happened in this case, but I have seen that happen in the past. So the fact that he did re-injure it while in rehab is very unfortunate. It seems like he was making such great progress leading up to it, but unfortunately he has in fact had that setback. Having a setback like that, unfortunately, is most likely going to reset the process over, and it's going to take him a while to heal. They haven't necessarily released the result whether or not it's a grade 1, 2, or 3 hamstring strain, so I'm not really going to speculate based on that. But the fact that they said that as of right now he is out indefinitely and haven't necessarily put a game number on it, I think that it is a fairly decent road ahead of Harden. But I'll be sure to update everybody in the comment section if I happen to hear any updated news. Also, if you happen to hear any updates, please feel free to post that as well. And that's it as of right now regarding James Harden's most recent hamstring re-injury. Once again, if you really like today's video and you find this content informative, please subscribe to the channel because I will be making more videos in the future. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.